What is up, gaming goblins? Yeatle here, your favorite top 500 YouTuber, coming at you with a map guide. Today we'll be covering what I believe to be one of the most misunderstood maps in the game. Hopefully by the end of this video I will have taught you how to solo carry this map or lead your team in the right direction. So immediately as the game starts, your goal should be to get the payload from this first corner to under the bridge. If the enemy team is not running a dive comp, you'll usually get this first corner without too much of a fight. In either case, it's going to be really important to take control of this bridge high ground, because whoever's up here is going to be terrorizing your squishies the entire time. So how do we take control of that? When I'm playing tank, as soon as the game starts, my first play is to go to this coast side all the way up to the mega, and I take control of that high ground by just being a tank. Usually I'll catch them off guard and get a free kill, or they'll try to challenge me, but in doing so, they lose a lot of resources because they're turning their back to my team basically. Ideally, this play is made by a tank, so it's safer, but if you're a hero that can win 1v1, go for it. And if you don't feel confident in your ability to win that 1v1, you can call for help and have one or two other people come and clear it with you. Once you clear this high ground, it's a lot easier to poke out the enemies on the buildings, and the people on point have an easier time pushing the point. If you're playing dive, there's a chance you might be able to just immediately poke these guys off the buildings, but if it's not working, you're better off just diving any of the other high grounds. So now you got the payload past the first corner, under bridge, but not quite past it. Your goal should now be to get the payload completely past this archway. Once again, pathing becomes important here. Let's assume the worst case scenario where the enemy team retakes high grounds. No matter what hero or comp you're on, the easy play to make is to just go under them and force the objective. This will make the enemy team either send one person to contest or give up their high ground. If you can't push the point anymore solo, this is the part where you either ask for help to 2v1 whoever's on point, or you have the whole team push to high ground. You can communicate that by simply saying, let's go bottom to high ground. Once you have control of this area, it then becomes easier to push the payload and have angles on the enemy team. After getting the payload far enough past the arches, it just becomes a game of controlling this green taco stand angles, playing to your comp's win conditions, and using your ults better. After capping first point, your immediate instinct should be go to high ground. Just make sure to leave one person on point. If you're not a mobile hero, the best way to go to high ground is go to this right side, up to the high ground. Getting pressure on this high ground early not only gives your team a chance to snowball, but it also gets the payload past the second corner. But if you couldn't get it past the second corner, now you have to do that. You can do that by either going under and pushing the payload or distracting them while somebody else pushes the payload. From here, the payload should be tiptoed to about under the bridge. Once it gets there, this is where teams usually struggle to adapt. Since your whole team will probably be on low ground, you can try to brute force it for this one attack, or if you're confident you can win the battle above bank, you can have one person push point while everybody else takes top. But if you get wiped and the payload's still at that corner, it's time for a change in plans. Ideally, most of the team goes high ground, while maybe one or two people force the objective. From my experience, if you go right and spam group up, people will usually follow you. From here, you'll want to mostly take control of this coast side high ground, that way it's harder for them to shoot at your payload pushers, but once again, depending on what you're working with, you can invest some resources into pushing that bank side high ground. If the payload was about to get capped but your team gets wiped, don't get lazy and walk main, go high ground, do it again. Now, if the enemy team's doing a really good job of shutting down this coast side, then you'll have to push main, or take the bank side high ground. Third point Dorado is one of the simplest points. If you just capped, you should immediately be walking the high ground. But let's assume you lost the fight and now the enemy team has control of high ground. Your team's goal should now be to get the payload under the bridge. There are three ways to do this. The best options depend on your team comp's strength. If you have a dive comp, you can dive top while somebody else pushes point. If you have a shield, you can probably just sit on point and shoot whoever touches. But if neither of those options seem viable, you can have one or two people push point while the rest of the team pushes top. Let's assume you got the payload under the bridge, but once again the enemy team has high ground control. You basically have all the same options you had before, except now you can just play under and push the payload. Eventually someone's going to have to drop and you can choose to focus that one person or go to high ground. And from there you basically just shoot point, use some ults, and offense is over. Now let's talk about defense. If you watch the first part of this video, you're going to start to notice that this is kind of like a recap for offense. If you have very mobile heroes, you're going to want to take control of yellow house and red house. When the payload gets to the corner, that's when you want to drop down and start clicking on people. If you don't get a kill, no problem. All you need to do is go back up, wait for cooldowns, and do it again. Sometimes you can look for engagements further, but generally you want to keep it at this corner, that way your team can shoot and heal. Now if you don't have any mobile heroes, you'll most likely be playing both ends of this bridge high ground. Usually most of the team will be on the right side, and it might be like 1 DPS on the left side. But what usually happens is that one DPS will get dove, pushed, or poked out by like 1 or 2 people. What I like to do as both tank and healer is play the same high ground as the DPS. That way it's a little bit harder for somebody to solo push him. So until they start sending more people up here, you'll have high ground dominance and it's going to be hard for them to push. If you're the support top right, you mostly just have to not get sniped, back up if you see a dive coming, and basically just keep people healed. And if you can do all those things without a problem, then you can just dish out damage. Alright, that's all fine and dandy, but let's say you lose that high ground and all you have is this main high ground. When the game's evolved to this point, usually the payload is approaching bridge or passing it. And this is where a lot of teams get into trouble. If the enemy team pushes it far enough, they can choose to go point and flip map, which basically means that now you have to attack while all they need to do is push the payload. So usually before that happens, you'll want to have like a tracer contest the payload at arches, but if you don't have a mobile DPS that can do that, or they end up needing help, then chances are the whole team's going to have to move main. Rolling back for a second, if you don't lose either of the high grounds, and the enemy team is struggling to push main, they might go for the underpass that I talked about on offense. If you see it coming, this is pretty easy to defend against, but make sure you have an ult plan because this is usually when ults get thrown left and right. And if you don't have any ults, and they start pressing Q, just give up the high ground. Once the attacking team has taco stand angles and payload cover, you as a defender will mostly be winning fights off of comp diff, ults, and the power of friendship. Now we're moving on to second point. First things first, if you died, you need to make it a habit to immediately go to high ground. Or, depending on where the payload's at, you might want to go co-side high ground. For the most part, you're going to be holding this high ground, but when payload gets to the second corner, you're going to want to have a mobile DPS or a tank contest. The reason we try to get a contest here is because if your team gets wiped, it'll be an easy recontest, whereas if the payload is under the bridge and you get wiped, you probably will have a really tough recontest or it won't happen. But if you do start to lose people at the second corner, see if you can keep control of high ground because that'll make it a lot easier for your team when you're on the recontest. Once the payload gets under bridge, it's a lot easier to abuse high ground since you can poke them from both sides. Ideally, you'll have somebody with mobility contest the payload so that it doesn't get too far past the bridge. One thing I forgot to mention is how to play against dive comps on this high ground. For the most part, they shouldn't be able to kill you unless they catch you off guard, or if you overstay your welcome. So when you see the dive coming, make sure you have 1 foot out the door. But also, you got to track ultimates, because if they're coming in with like Nano Blade or Primal, you might want to position to make that a little bit harder for them. If the enemy team decides to go bank, you can usually catch somebody in rotation, but if you don't, you can also challenge them at the staircase or back up and abuse the crossfire. Let's say you wipe the enemy team and you see them regrouping and you know they're going to go co-side. This is where you call it out for your team, and if you're quick enough, you can completely deny them from taking this high ground. But if they manage to take this opposite high ground, then the playing field is a little bit more leveled, so all you can really do is poke and shoot at whoever's on point. So your team got wiped and third point rolls in. Your immediate thought should be, I'm going to high ground. As you learned on offense, controlling this high ground controls this third point. Ideally, you just abuse high grounds here and you have somebody contest the payload before it gets under the bridge. That way, if your team gets wiped, you're guaranteed a recontest. If the enemy team goes high ground and they start popping ults that you can't fight, don't die for it. Just give up the high ground. If your team's dying anyways, at the very least, contest the point. If you're recontesting and your team doesn't have time to go to high ground, you have a couple options. You can go main, straight to point for the fastest way to point. If the enemy team has dive, going to this far side is pretty good. It makes it harder for them to get to you. Or you can go to this high ground side, which gives you an angle on the enemy backline, but it might put you under pressure too. And there you have it, an in-depth guide for Dorado. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to secure the high ground and collapse on that like button, and leave a comment down below for what you think is the most misunderstood map in Overwatch. Who knows, I might just make a video on it. That's going to be it for this video. As always, thank you for watching, and good luck on the grind.